The first step to subverting expectations is not to discuss your plans to subvert expectations. The second step to subverting expectations... Don't Ryan Johnson it! Hey everyone, just a quick reminder for you all. I've got a fantasy adventure webcomic called Phoenix Rising available to read over on webtoons.com right now. Follow the link in the description box down below to check it out. Greetings and salutations, friends and gamers of all stripes. My name is GM Dave. I am your man behind the screen. Today we're doing something a little bit different this time. We're actually doing a response video to the DeadAussieGamer's video on subverting expectations.
G'day guys and welcome, my name's Michael and I am the DeadAussieGamer, here to share with you my tips, tricks, ideas and strategies for playing and running tabletop role-playing games.
Link to his video in the description down below. I do highly recommend watching it before watching this if you haven't already, so that way you get the full context of what we're going to be discussing here. Now, one thing I want to make clear with this is not your typical response video that you'll often see of people trying to break down a person's argument. Quite the opposite, in fact. I think that the DeadAussieGamer was getting on the right track with the things that he was discussing regarding subversion of expectations in tabletop role-playing games, so much so that it got my gears turning and I decided I want to kind of expand on his points a little bit. So with that in mind, we're going to be looking at some of the do's and don'ts of how to subvert expectation in your role-playing game by distilling these into 5, what I hope will be very helpful tips. Tip number 1, don't discuss your plans unless you're asking for help. Now, it should go without saying that obviously we don't want to discuss our plans to subvert expectations with the players in our games, otherwise they're not going to be surprised. Their expectations won't be subverted. But when we start having these plans come to fruition, when we start having these ideas, the temptation is really there to go out there and discuss it with some of our other friends, people who might not be involved in the game. Don't do this. Seriously, don't do this. This is a trap. This is a trap for the exact same reason why it is recommended for writers not to discuss the plots and plans of their books with their friends, because by doing so, you trick your brain into getting the satisfaction of putting out the surprise already. It disincentivizes you from actually following through on your plans. Now, obviously, the exception to this rule is going to be if you're discussing this with people to get advice, to ask for help. You should absolutely do this. If you're not sure how to approach this subject, if you're not sure how to subvert your players' expectations with a specific quest or specific adventure that you have in mind, reach out to other people and ask them for advice. Absolutely. But do not reach out just to discuss what your plans are, because that psychological trick will come into play, and in the end, you're basically just killing your own satisfaction with that subversion. You're going to have felt a little bit of that satisfaction just by discussing it and having those friends say, wow, dude, that's actually a really cool idea. Yeah, you should totally do that. It's a trap. Don't do it. It's easy to fall into. Don't do it. Trust me on this. It's going to end up being far less satisfying for you because the reaction from your players isn't going to feel as fresh and as strong as it would have if you had just kept it in and let the surprise be theirs first. Point number 2. Seriously, don't Ryan Johnson it. You thought that was a joke at the beginning, didn't you? Me showing up in the tabard with the sword, subverting your expectations by the simple fact that I haven't actually appeared on camera in who knows how many months? Yeah, no. I was actually being partly serious there. Don't Ryan Johnson it. Or another way of saying it, don't subvert just for the sake of subverting. Look, it should be pretty obvious by me putting this in here that I am not a fan of The Last Jedi, so I'm not going to talk your ear off about the problems with that movie. Believe me, I could probably spend longer than the movie's running time actually doing that. Nevertheless, one of the key reasons why that movie was an abject failure for so many people is that Ryan Johnson decided that he was going to subvert expectations just for the sake of being able to do so. And he did so without an understanding of the characters of the world, of the lore, the setting, any of that. Subversion for the sake of subversion doesn't work. All it does is confuse people and generally tends to frustrate them. This is just as true in tabletop games as it was in The Last Jedi. Because if you start subverting expectations just for the sake of doing so, what you're going to end up with is an inconsistent mess of a game. Now, inconsistency is not always a killer of games, but it certainly can be a killer of sessions, especially if you push it too far. So don't subvert for the sake of subverting, and just as an added note here, don't overdo it either. Because let's be honest, that was another big problem of the whole Rian Johnson, I'm subverting expectations train. Part 3. Understand your players and their characters. Yes, we're playing off a bit of some of the stuff that I mentioned in the previous point. So, if your group is a new group to you, or your players are toying with new concepts, don't dive straight into the idea of trying to subvert their expectations with crazy twists and turns in your story before you understand the type of player they are or the type of character they are playing. The reason for this is if you start doing this, you may well end up playing right into their hands, just doing something that they as a player, or that their character in the mindset that they're in, totally expects. You might end up actually shooting yourself in the foot because you didn't do the necessary prep work ahead of time. On the flip side, you could also end up providing a kind of subversion that goes completely against the grain of what they're expecting to such a degree that it ends up harming the game. I know I said in the previous point that I wouldn't do this, but one of the reasons why the surprise of Luke hucking the lightsaber over his shoulder in The Last Jedi came as something so shocking and distasteful to a lot of the longtime fans is because that is something that Luke's character, as he is established, would never have done. So if you start attempting to subvert the expectations of your players and their characters too early, particularly when they're trying out new things, you could end up going so hard against the grain with them that it ends up being a more negative experience for them than a positive one. Now, I will grant that this is not an entirely likely experience in a tabletop role-playing game, but the risk is still there. So in those early sessions, when you're getting to know the feel of your group, the feel of your players, or if these are experienced players that you played with before, the feel of new player characters when they're testing new concepts, try not to subvert in the early stages. Let things ride, play things as standard, and then, once you have that better understanding, start looking at how you can subvert in certain ways so that it ends up being a positive experience for yourself and your players. Part 4. Make sure it fits the tone and the setting. Mild subversion of tone is a perfectly fine thing to do. I want to get that out of the way first and foremost. In fact, mild subversion of the tone can sometimes be very important for breaking up the pace, breaking up the tension, making things a little easier to take in. When we have chapters in books that are a little bit slower, for example, that could be considered a mild subversion of the tone because you're pulling back from the tense moments, the intensity that really drives us to keep going forward. Similarly, when you have moments of comedy in horror movies, that's a mild subversion of the tone. That makes it so that it's easier to go through the slog of intense emotions that a good horror movie is supposed to bring. In other words, mild subversion of the tone can be used to help keep things fresh when moving forward. We are mixing up the emotions that we're engaging with, the events that we're engaging with, so that way we don't get bogged down. What's more, they'll also give us some moments to take in the bigger, more emotional events in our games, so that way the weight and impact of those moments becomes stronger. Handled correctly, mild subversion of the tone is one of the greatest tools you, as a game master, can provide. However, the key thing here is mild subversion. You don't want to flip the story on its head unless a particular session really calls for that. And even then, I tend to avoid doing those things myself because more often than not, it tends to break the immersion in the game. If your subversion grates against the tone and setting of your game, what you're ultimately going to end up doing is not subverting your players' expectations, but rather ripping their immersion away from them. Even in a gonzo setting where things are over the top and ridiculous, a subversion needs to work within that setting's context. If the subversion grates against it, If you have a gonzo game, for example, that is over the top and ridiculous, and your subversion suddenly twists things on their head so that they are dead serious and super dramatic, your players aren't going to be satisfied with that. That's not what they came to play. That's not the kind of game they signed up for. So what you're going to end up doing if you do that is not only taking away their immersion, but harming their ability to get invested in the game because you've just changed everything with a snap of the fingers. And finally, we reach our final point. Point 5. Maximize the impact without taking it out of the player's hands. The ultimate goal is to surprise your players. The ultimate goal is to subvert their expectations in such a way that they get an experience that they didn't see coming. But if that comes at the cost of their freedom of choice with their characters, they're not likely to feel that what they got was a satisfying subversion of expectation. Instead, they're much more likely to feel that what they got was punished for a twist that they didn't see coming. So even though it is your plan to subvert their expectations, even though you are the one who has set this up, you are the one who needs to execute this in such a way that they end up surprised, let them take the reins on when and how it's revealed. Let their decisions dictate how you show it to them. But do not, under any circumstances, steal their choice away from them. Because all you'll accomplish by doing that, apart from probably royally pissing your group off, is stealing any and all satisfaction that they would have had from that subversion away from them. Because instead of making them feel surprised, you made them feel punished. And that should just about cover our thoughts on subversion of expectations in tabletop games. So a question for my fellow GMs out there before we sign off. How have you subverted your players' expectations? What are some of the stories of your successes and failures in this regard? Because we all know that every single one of us has both successes and failures when it comes to this. Let us know in the comments below and let's see what we can learn from these sorts of things. If you like the content, please feel free to subscribe, hit the bell notification icon for notification, but more importantly, open up the description box down below and follow me on my social media presences. Minds.com in particular is the best place to follow me to not only get notifications for my YouTube videos, but my other projects as well, such as Phoenix Rising and the upcoming game that I've been designing, which we are going to start putting out some vlogs for discussing the progress of the design process. And just as another reminder, make sure to check out DeadAussieGamer's video in the link in the description down below, as well as some of his other works. I, for one, am a big fan of Michael and the stuff that he puts out, and you know, he gives some pretty damn good advice, so I would definitely recommend checking him out, subscribe to his channel, give him a little bit of love as well. And so, friends and gamers, before we end this, I would just like to remind you once more that in the world of tabletop gaming, you don't just want to watch. Get out there and game. Have a good one.
Are you cold? Oh, good hunter.